Очень рада вас всех видеть на очередном мероприятии в рамках нашей дискуссионно-образовательной программы. Как вы помните, наша программа озаглавлена «Цифровая экология. Искусство после интернета». И большую часть времени мы говорили об искусстве после интернета в рамках наших мероприятий. Но, наконец, к нам приехал человек, который поговорит с нами об экологии. И я с удовольствием представляю вам Элвию Уилк. Почему-то у меня попытался выключиться микрофон, извините. Элвия приехала к нам из Берлина. Она автор статьи в каталоге. И помимо того, что она автор статьи в каталоге, она вообще искусствовед, художественный критик, автор и редактор многих важных текстов. Она сотрудничает и с Ефлаксом, и с Фризом, и с Ризомой, и с такими ресурсами, как Трансмедиале и так далее. И вот сегодняшняя ее лекция озаглавлена «Машина времени. Эко, арт и предыстория искусства». Пожалуйста, Элвия, тебе слово. Спасибо за согласие участвовать в нашей программе.
Спасибо. Thank you. Can you hear me? Good. I'm Элвия Уилк. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be in Moscow. I'm going to give a talk today based on the catalog essay I wrote for the Biennale catalog, which I've expanded quite a bit, and also I luckily got to see the exhibition today, so I've probably added some new ideas in. I guess we will start with time travel. Light takes time to travel across galaxies, and so the images that we see through telescopes are as old as they are far away. The farthest images of the universe we've been able to capture so far are about 13.2 billion years old. Those are of the galaxy cluster Abell 2744, which you can see here in the background, and also in these images. These pictures are from a time when stars were just beginning to form from storms of interstellar matter and gas. Our entire universe is estimated to be about 13.7 billion years old, so these are actually pretty close to the beginning of time. One astronomer called these pictures the first ultrasounds of an infant, meaning our universe. And it's conceivable that as we keep developing stronger and stronger telescopes that can see farther and farther away, someday we might be able to see an image from the beginning or before the beginning of time. Here's another telescope of sorts. This is Stonehenge, built between 3000 and 2000 BCE. Most evidence points to the probability that it was built as an astronomical observatory because the circle of stones are placed in accordance with celestial cycles, suggesting the formation was used to predict and also to watch important cosmic events like eclipses. We can think of Stonehenge as a technology, but we can also think of it as an artwork. It's a human imprint on the land that is as aesthetically meaningful as it is useful. In this talk, I want to think of art throughout time as a kind of technology, as a time machine that allows us to comprehend the present through our relationships with the past, and ultimately our relationship with time itself. In 1983, the writer and historian Lucy Lepard published a book called Overlay, Contemporary Art and the Art of Prehistory, in which she took this approach towards art as a time machine too. Just let me know if you can't hear me, and I will move it. The book Overlay is a comprehensive study of elemental visual forms from prehistoric earthworks like Stonehenge, juxtaposed with a strand of contemporary art that emerged in her time, which I'll loosely call ленд-арт, even though it encompassed a lot of other kinds of practices. Lepard started writing Overlay in 1977 while she was on a self-imposed nature retreat. She had hoped to find respite from the contemporary art scene, whose social and political machinations she was exhausted with, and instead she found herself looping back to it, prompted by her discovery of a line of ancient stones in the English countryside. Contemplation of this ancient act of creation led her on a quest to reclaim what she called, quote, the symbolic possibility in contemporary art through excavating its subterranean layers, unquote. Those layers being fundamental questions about the impulse behind the creative act, the distinction between art and life, and the origins of basic forms abstracted from nature. Lepard wrote that it was through studying ancient works like Stonehenge that she began to perceive places as spatial metaphors for temporal distance, allowing us to, quote, explore the crucial connections between, it's getting louder, right? I think. Allowing us to explore the crucial connections between individual desires to make something, to hold something, and the social values that determine what we make and why. Human prehistory was so interesting to Lepard because it's so distant and so unknowable that it becomes a total projection of our own needs and desires. She wrote that the enigma of Stonehenge, for instance, simply increases with the burgeoning information about its use as an astronomical observatory, since that in turn suggests the possibility of all sorts of other uses and meanings. All constructions of the past are imaginaries, and so looking at the way land art of her time related to, appropriated, and reimagined prehistory was her way of understanding the shifting ground of contemporary art. The title of the book and of this talk, Overlay, refers to a temporal overlay of human time on geological time, which she called contemporary notions of novelty and obsolescence overlaid on prehistoric notions of natural growth and cycles, as well as to the rhythms of the human body overlaid on the Earth's cycles, and the overlay of cultures, worldviews, and religions upon one another, evidenced in archaeological traces on the land. Land art, as it's been historicized, was a movement spearheaded by a group of artists who came together first in a prominent way in the 1968 exhibition Earthworks at the Dewan Gallery in New York City. The show included Robert Smithson, Hans Haacke, Walter de Maria, and Dennis Oppenheim, to name a few. And the main uniting factor of land art practices by those artists was an emphasis on sightedness. That is, artwork as fundamentally contextual, and specifically contextual in the natural landscape, coexistent and co-designed by natural forces over time. This was a purposeful deviation from object-based, exhibition-centric modernism, which was seen as artificially removed from the natural environment and natural time. Land art made clear aesthetic references to what Lepard called primal forms. I'm just going to go through some land art earthworks, juxtaposed with ancient art, to give you an idea of the aesthetic vocabulary that Lepard was working with. First, of course, the circle. This is the Ring of Brogdar in the UK from about 2500 BCE. And here we are in 1971. This is a work by Richard Long in the Andes. Then Lepard's favorite, which is the mound. This is the Douth Mound in Ireland from the Stone Age. And this is a work by Hans Haacke from 1969. These are just some examples, but really these forms occur and occur and occur throughout both prehistoric and land art. The intersecting lines on a landscape, these are the Nazca Plains in Peru. You can only see these works from an aerial perspective. And two works from 1968. This is Dennis Oppenheim, where he would run a snowmobile over the landscape and then I think a crop harvester for the period of an hour. And then Walter de Maria, two parallel lines, a mile long. The favorite of all the land artists, the spiral or the labyrinth. These are from 1600 BC in the UK. And this sort of labyrinth with a line leading out is found all over the world. Here's one from Rutland in the UK, which was actually a medieval reconstruction of a labyrinth that was originally built in the prehistoric era. So there are sort of layers and layers of reconstructions of this shape. 1974, this is Richard Fleischner's sod maze covered in snow. Another work by Richard Long, this one in Ireland. And the classic, famous spiral jetty. The ring or the observatory, this is one from the Bronze Age in the UK, was what Lepard chose for the cover of her book. This is a work by Nancy Holt. And I think the observatory ring is most clearly a telescopic form, though all of those shapes could in some ways be viewed as a way of getting closer to understanding the cosmos. So all of the pieces from the period that I just showed, except for this last one by Nancy Holt, are well-known and canonical works by white men. But many of the practices that Lepard was most interested in, and which I'm most interested in, which similarly engage site specificity, ephemerality, and the landscape, were not necessarily one-to-one man intervenes in nature gestures, but instead they proposed a permeability between human and landscape through sometimes unmonumental approaches. Unsurprisingly, they were often made by women and minorities. A large part of the book is devoted to bringing those artists into the discourse. This is a piece by Judy Chicago. She did a long series called Women and Smoke, and these are 2 performances. This is a work by Mary Beth Edelson from 1977. She did performances within various shapes, and this was a spiral performance. This is a work by Carolee Schneemann, the performance artist who overlaid shapes on her body, just as a reference with the snake. This is the Serpent Mound in Ohio from 300 BCE. So just to show some of the other forms that were being adopted. Ana Mendieta made many works where she hid herself or left traces of herself in the landscape. So those artists were often excluded from the canon. That's due, of course, to ordinary and pervasive institutional sexism, but it's also specifically and interestingly that they were excluded from the land art canon because their feminist practices often included their own bodies as their site or material. So the site-specific nature of their land art was an embodied or even personal one, which deconstructed the division between the self and the earth that many masculinist land art practices ended up perpetuating instead of deconstructing. The fact that the female body has for so long been aligned with the nature side of the nature-culture divide paradoxically disallowed them from participating in land art, meaning these women artists, which was supposedly nature-based, but in fact usually accorded to a logic of domination. And yet the female association with Mother Earth presented a double bind for those women. How could women artists borrow and manipulate symbolism drawn from nature without simply perpetuating new cliches? Or in a broader sense, how could they interact with their embodied marginalization without marginalizing themselves further? How can the natural be approached not as primitive or universal, but as a vehicle for collective understanding and collective action? One way of thinking about those conundrums is from the perspective of Marxist feminisms of the 1970s, which argued for the valorization of reproductive or domestic labor as waged work. I would suggest that female artists making embodied art in relation to the environment in the 60s and 70s were making a similar argument, but not only that the work of their bodies should be waged, though of course that was part and parcel of the issue, but also arguing for valorization under an intertwined system of value, not economic, that is, a system of cultural value. These acts of embodied artistic labor should, just like spiral jetty, for instance, be considered inceptionary creative inventions. And it was precisely their embodied nature that opened up a whole new imaginative space for a non-fixed and non-object-centric version of history. Lepard suggested, in my reading of her book, that it was for this reason that women and other marginalized groups were those best equipped to deconstruct the boundary between art and life that many white male 20th century cultural movements, including abstract expressionism, modernism, and most of land art, had purported to do. She argued that those movements succeeded in expanding art's meaning in daily life only very rarely, and that land art practices by those on the margins had the potential to achieve what they had not. It's another piece by Ana Mendieta, 2 separate pieces, both involving trees. So part of Lepard's project was a rewriting of land art practices through a revision of the male-centric prehistoric narratives upon which the movement based itself. But crucially, she resisted universalization of the meanings of the elemental forms and systems that she imagined. She was aware of the mythological lineage, for instance, the snake as a symbol of water or fertility, but she didn't argue that there was necessarily something inherent in the visual forms that transcends time or cultural boundaries. Meanings shift and evolve, and most importantly, they can be appropriated towards political aims. She deliberately moved away from promoting the existence of anything inherently pure or natural, instead muddying dichotomies and tracking morphological changes and crossings over time. From a circle of stones to a handprint on a wall, she sought historical connections while affording cultural and historic specificity to their meanings. It was in this tension between specificity and universality, performed through engagement with the natural environment, that she perceived a potential for political action. Lepard's analysis of the appropriation of visual metaphors relating to land art and geology in the 60s and 70s does not call for a glorification of the primitive or a return to an apolitical, acultural nature, but presents complex ways that they could be appropriated, even weaponized towards change. Stasis and motion are not mutually exclusive. We can find ways to move and affect change by finding consistent, common spaces through time. So throughout the next part of this talk, I want to keep the idea of the political always in mind. On June 20th of this year, there was a special cosmic event. The full moon coincided with the summer solstice, which is the longest day of the year. When this happens, it's called a strawberry moon, and it was the first time that had happened since 1967. On the night of the strawberry moon, I was walking home with two friends, and we all stopped suddenly to stare up at the sky. We didn't know that we were witnessing something unusual, but the moon looked special, and we all felt really strange. 50 years ago, the story would have stopped there. But as soon as I got home, I checked Facebook, which notified me through a promoted post that I had just seen a special cosmological event. I think the promoted posts were timed to appear on my feed when it was evening in my time zone, and Google could see that I had just been outside. Then a friend who I had been walking home with wrote to me saying she'd also seen a post online about the moon. Facebook might have known that we were together. She had even learned more, which was that there's an annual solstice party at Stonehenge, which was supposed to be extra big that year, but for unknown reasons, was very underattended. So then I spent the rest of the night researching Stonehenge online. Overall, this sounds like a pretty banal experience, but afterwards I was hit by a feeling of acute vertigo, a sense of space and time collapsing. Earthbound ecological cycles, the rhythm of the cosmos, and the incomprehensible space of the digital had collided with my small existence in the form of my Android phone with a Facebook app on it. Though human experience of the cosmos has always been mediated to some extent by technology, today it's overwhelmingly technologically mediated to a point of being obscured. You can see how many cameras are in the photo of Stonehenge. From the cycles of the cosmos to the cycles of our bodies, physiology and geology are calculated and commoditized, but the visualizations we rely on are not unlike the most basic prehistoric visualizations of cyclic time passing. This is Clue, which is a period tracker app that shows you where you are in your menstrual cycle after you input some basic data about yourself. It's essentially a ring of stones. Today, rapid information transfer rips together time and space in unfathomable ways. On a day-to-day scale, we experience this conflation every time we write emails. On a planetary scale, advancements in geology and astronomy, like the images arriving through super telescopes, have made us aware of the relations between space and time in ever vaster ways. Add to this an awareness of deep time, which is the knowledge that even prehistory is incredibly recent on the scale of the universe, as well as just how much human impact has changed the planet since our arrival, and a new existential understanding of human finitude is necessary to factor into contemporary reckoning with the cosmos. So in this part of the talk, I'd like to add another overlay onto Lepard's by looking at contemporary art on top of land art, on top of prehistory. The Moscow International Biennale for Young Art, which we are in the midst of right now, presents a whole spectrum of contemporary art to choose from. So I'm going to talk through some of those artists who are included in the exhibitions to present the visual vocabulary of the contemporary. First of all, though, it's important to point out that the very same strategies central to land art as a historical phenomenon are in fact alive and well. Still living artists from that generation, like Christo and John Claude, are still doing what they've always done. But also contemporary artists are picking up these strategies, building earthwork-style, site-specific, temporary interventions in a landscape, albeit mediated and documented sometimes through different technologies. One artist at the Biennale, Giuliana Cerquera-Lecci, has a work called Three Dances in the show, which is a group of plaster sculptures produced on-site through impressions from her body as she performed dance movements. It's a record of an embodied performance and a record of time passing. Claire Pogam juxtaposes the life cycles of generation and decay with geological formations. In this photographic documentation series, raw meat is splayed out across stones. I would just briefly refer back here to practices by artists in the 70s who were very engaged with meat too, as a classic vanitas symbol of mortality and degradation. On the left is a work by Carolee Schneemann, and on the right is a work by Arthur Bayrou. Back to today. This artist, Veronica Geiger, has a work called Imprint, which is a documentation of the atmospheric changes in an Icelandic lake through exposure of photographic paper in the water, which records the ambient light. Eli Maria Lundgaard is showing a video called 100 Explanations for a Single Thing, which is a documentation of a forest walk with a first-person narration about the way her present tense experience is mediated through memories as a sort of technological device themselves. So these works are all forms of documentation. They're evidence of time-based events. One minor distinction between then and now is that whereas land artists tended to draw a pretty clear hierarchy between the event as the artwork and its documentation as a secondary product that incidentally allowed it to be displayed, commodified, historicized, and sold, I see a difference in that these contemporary pieces, the act of production exists on a flat hierarchy with its evidentiary product. That has to do partially with the way the internet has blurred the boundary between a physical happening and its circulation online, and also with changing institutional structures whereby value is determined via commodification. In any case, while the relationship between the work and its preservation, or the work and its referent, may be changing, these previous examples are all highly situated practices, fully engaged with the present moment and the subjective experience of natural surroundings. They're rooted in the act of leaving a human trace on material reality. In those regards, and regardless of the technological means of their documentation, these types of methodologies will always be both ancient and contemporary. Artists have been pursuing these strategies for a variety of reasons since the Paleolithic. Now I'd like to focus first on a set of contemporary practices whose lineage to land art might not be so immediate, but which ultimately demonstrate a similar set of concerns through a highly specific contemporary lens. I propose to use them as a third overlay of artistic practice. They're polyvocal, but as a shorthand, I'll propose to call them eco-art. The eco prefix connotes the fact that the work is indebted, directly or indirectly, to the legacy of land art. But eco also refers to the current sociological state in which our relationship to the environment has been entirely commodified. What could be called the contemporary eco-mentality is the reduce and reuse environmentalism light non-ideology of the neoliberal subject. Eco-art lives within and offers potential paths out of the labyrinth that the neoliberal subject is mired in. The theorist Irmgard Emmelheins gives a good description of this contemporary societal maze. He writes, quote, "Critical disposition, symbolic gesture, political position, and everyday life are completely dissociated. This dissociation leads to pervasive contradictions, denouncing hunger in Africa but drinking coffee at Starbucks, expressing solidarity with Palestinians but consuming Israeli goods, protesting against violence but exploiting one's own employees, opposing slavery but buying clothing manufactured by enslaved people in Southeast Asia, expressing concern about global warming but buying food in supermarkets, applying for government and corporate funds to produce projects that critique them. Our post-political and post-ideological era is characterized by a sharp discrepancy between political action, political position, and symbolic gesture. In other words, rather than symbolic gestures as vehicles for political action, symbols can now be bought and sold as substitutes for political action. Symbols that in the 1960s may have forged common ground have now become empty of their reference and can become excuses for inaction. So, like land art, eco-art employs ancient forms and symbols, but these are used with a full awareness of their co-option and commodification. One of the simplest ways to think about this would be through the seemingly endless spate of contemporary art that includes water bottles, which really hammers home the point of how the basic natural element of water is commodified and sold back to us with value added, creating consumers out of everyone just by dint of the fact that we're drinking water. This water bottle concept is, I think, a very basic and common substrate of most eco-art, though a lot of work reinvests the commodification process with mystery and meaning rather than reducing it to the banality that it already is. Another attribute of eco-art is that its aesthetics and methodologies are informed by the digital landscape as well as the physical one. The digital world has in many ways become naturalized. Those of us who use networked systems understand them as physical spaces to navigate, and spatial metaphors abound when we talk about web space. We have a window, a browser, and a site. A website provides a whole new opportunity for sightedness in the most basic sense. And so I would add to Lepard's list of overlays an overlay of digital unphysical and vice versa. This is a work by David Quayola that's showing right now at the Biennale. And if it works, technically, I will play it. That's a video of trees in the south of France, whose image is being slowly digitally manipulated to look like a moving set of brushstrokes. The effect is a strange abstraction from natural time and a heightened awareness of how our vision is modified by technological filtering from every day. To quote the artist, quote, "I'm fascinated by how technological mediation in our society can enable a different kind of vision. We're at a moment in time when we are not only surprised by looking at new things, but we're also looking with a new pair of eyes enabled by technology." So I bring that up to talk about how it's not only nature itself that we are changing ourselves, but our ways of perceiving it. Another piece about how the landscape is refracted through now ubiquitous technologies is by the artist duo Gregoire Blunt and Emmy Skensved. I'm going to show a short trailer for their piece at the Biennale. It's a long work, but the trailer gives a sketch of the themes that it covers. Essentially, you get the idea that the entire world is contained on this handheld device. And at one point, the devices are replicated into this kind of helix structure in a sequence that suggests the sequential time has become construed as a series of constant software updates. The Earth in the image is static. What's changing, replicating, and evolving is only the technological way that we access it through this tablet device that they focus on. Along those lines, I would say that eco-art has a different understanding of temporality than land art style practices do. Formally, its processes often resemble a closed loop rather than cycles of generation and decay. Eco-art is both generative and commemorative in an endless loop. For instance, in this sculptural work by the artist Verena Friedrich, the artist isolates a set of physical processes, reducing life cycles to an object-based performance within a small glass chamber. I'll let the artist explain how the work performs itself. This is a few-minute explanation by her. Oh, excuse me.
Work is about, in general, about the topic of the prolongation of life through science and technology, basically. And it's demonstrated in this installation in a little bit of an ironic way. I'm using the object of a soap bubble, and the reason is that in my work I have been dealing with these vanitas symbols since a while, so soap bubbles as well as, for example, candles, which are used in previous installations. We know that from art, from paintings, for example, they usually stand for the brevity of life. And in my work I'm basically building machineries where I can manipulate these fragile and ephemeral and organic objects in a way that they basically persist longer. The machinery generates a bubble. It's a little robot that basically drops a bubble, generates a soap bubble in this very moment, which drops into the box where it's kept floating by certain measures that I'm taking. So I'm building a controlled environment basically inside the box to keep the bubble levitating. And also it's rather, the temperature is lowered inside the box, so ideally the bubble really stays stable for a rather long time, and we can really look at it like much longer than usual, basically. This gas atmosphere, which comes from this dry ice block, that basically makes the bubble float. So what I'm doing now is I'm taking the atmosphere out. And what will happen now during the next 5 minutes is that the atmosphere builds up again slowly, so this block produces again carbon dioxide, and when the box is like half full, then it's automatically measured, and this small machinery, this little robot, will produce a new bubble by dipping into the liquid and going into the box. So we, depending on how much time we still have, we might see another bubble being produced and dropping into the middle of the box. And the main concept, just to make it very brief, was basically the idea to prolong the lifetime of the soap bubble. I have this fascination for, I don't know, probably this contrast between technology and science, or technology which claims to stabilize things and control things also. And I'm interested in building practical setups in which I test this in a way, and I often use organic materials or biological materials, where I'm trying to explore how far this stabilization is actually possible, because it's always possible to a certain extent, and depending how much work you actually put into it or how precise you get, but still these materials still remain fragile and cannot be fully controlled and still play out their own characteristics. So that's what still stays also fascinating for me in this installation, that even although I've built the system myself, I often cannot really predict what will happen in the course of the experiment or whether it will work, and often it's kind of really complex environments, not necessarily complex technically, but the whole environment with the different factors like the bubble and the gas atmosphere, you change a small aspect and then everything works differently.
So I let her talk for so long because I think she explains it really well, what's so fundamental about this piece, that it's really the opposite of a land art strategy that might create a ring of stones on the ground and sort of let them decay over time and get covered with snow and demonstrate their own life cycles. Whereas this is really an artificially forged environment where this elemental sphere is kept in artificial life as long as possible. So it doesn't mimic the cycles of the earth or the tides or the cosmos as a land art piece might, but replicates the form of a scientific experiment, presenting itself in relation to empirical study. Another important aspect of that work is that it is performative, but it performs itself without human intervention once the process is started. So the human creates the conditions, but then the actual animation is happening not through an embodied actor, but through an object interaction. We live in a time when objects are networked, communicative actors themselves. You can think of the smart city or the Internet of Things, where objects wirelessly communicate with each other, or financial markets that perform transactions faster than the human mind can comprehend. So the performativity of eco-art is not limited to the slowness of the human body or the even slowerness of time. It construes performance as a collaboration between living and non-living things. Marguerite Humeau is a French artist who explores the means by which knowledge is generated in the absence of evidence, or the tenuous relationship between the scientific and the mythic. Her installations are performative in that they're anthropomorphic. They animate themselves. For a work called The Opera of Prehistoric Creatures in 2012, she used archaeological evidence acquired from a natural history museum to build a structure that loosely replicates the mouths, windpipes, and lungs of prehistoric animals, through which air was blown to approximate what sounds they might have made. Because there are no fossil records of the actual soft tissues of ancient creatures, she could only imaginatively approximate the ways that their physical structures would have been shaped. And so she is effectively co-designing their bodies. Here are some of the sounds that emerged from the sculpture when it was installed. I'll stop it there. You get the idea. In another sound sculpture called Screams from Hell, she animated geology instead of dead animals. Inspired by the recordings of screams that emanate from fissures in the planet's crust, the piece, quote, comprised a choir of shrieking and bellowing sculptures, unquote. Using various rare minerals to produce and amplify sounds and also to power a burst of flame, the requiem is for a changing planet and for a type of human relationship to the earth that's hard to actually make out today. These constructions are imagined archaeologies, but are also imagined futurisms. What will happen to our own soft tissues when our species is gone? Can information capture the way living systems work? In the series of mechanical processes that drive eco-art installations like Humeau's, a collaboration between human and non-human actors is forged, but not in the sense of a flat hierarchy. Life might be absent, but it's longed for. In a purely formal sense, the mechanics of the science experiment installation, like the soap bubble one or these prehistoric creature ones, is that it acknowledges a direct cause and effect relationship. This bellow prompts this flow of air, which bursts this flame. It's a Rube Goldberg that implies the domino effect of human activity on the environment. As a final attribute, which I mentioned earlier, eco-art has an acute and painful awareness of environmental collapse, which is related to all of the above formal decisions and strategies, and which probably accounts for the mournful lamentation nature of so many of these projects. Here there's a clear parallel with the fear and crisis rhetoric surrounding technological change that partially is what spurred on the land-art movement 50 years ago. The media theorist Jussi Parikka wrote in a recent essay, quote, "It is significant that land art emerges after World War II. The dates identified recently as key to the Anthropocene era are the start of the nuclear explosion age and the Great Acceleration, produced by a massive number of interlinked chemical, technological, economic, lifestyle, and general biotic changes. As a broader environmental consciousness that was part of the emergence of earthworks, although the actual term Anthropocene came later." By later, he means more or less now. The broader environmental consciousness of the 1960s can only have intensified in the last decade, now that we've entered what has become consensually referred to as the age of the Anthropocene, when human impact on the environment has so drastically affected its course. Though I would prefer to use Donna Haraway's term, the capitalocene, to point out that environmental crisis is intrinsically tied to the economic system of value extraction under which we live. I highlight this because, as I talked about at the beginning, references to nature and art can only have become more inherently political. Here I'm going to show a trailer for a longer work by Anna Vaz and Tristan Berra called A Film Reclaimed that clearly addresses this sort of crisis rhetoric.
Il n'y a pas de catastrophe naturelle.
Il n'y a que des catastrophes naturelles.
La nature est un construit. Nous sommes la nature. Nous sommes la catastrophe. Faut-il encore parler de globalité, là où il n'y a que des inégalités territoriales, avec des degrés différents d'intégration dans la mondialisation, des zones critiques?
Deterritorialize.
The artist described the video by saying, quote, "The ecological crisis is a political, economic, and social crisis. It's also cinematographic, as cinema coincides historically and in a critical and descriptive way with the development of the Anthropocene. A Film Reclaimed is a conversation, an essay that reads the terrestrial crisis under the influence and with the help of the beautiful and terrible films which have accompanied it," unquote. So in this way, the artists acknowledge art's complicity in the structures of power that have led us to the moment of environmental collapse. Eco-art imagines the world without us, either the world deep in the past or deep in the future, or just the aspects of the world coexistent with us beyond our comprehension. For instance, Joey Holder's work, which is on show at the Biennale, that's called Feldspar, Hadal Zone, is titled after the zone of the deepest ocean trenches, an area originally named after Hades, god of the underworld. A floor print reproducing the contours of that surface under the water is spread around the exhibition space, depicting depth and variegation, but entirely flat. This depicts an area of the Earth that has until very recently been completely unknowable. Now that we have the advanced technological means to simulate what it looks like, but the artist seems to argue that its imaginative potential only increases along with our knowledge of it. Scientific knowledge does not defeat creative potential, it makes imaginative labor even more urgent. At the same time, this work is an anticipatory memorial for a future in which the oceans may have dried out and the visualization is all we have left. Not only the natural environment will be lost, but also human civilization. The simulation and recreation of past cultures is the focus of Mariana Silva's Digital Specimens Point Cloud Fallout, in which the preservation of ruins becomes the extension of virtual reality. So I think this is the last video I'll show.
Flux of tourists have been organising diving expeditions to see the underwater ruins. It happens mostly in weak economies. Soon, international waters will be the place of leisure, casinos, international law, abortion clinics, and the past. For decades, the entertainment industry pioneered with floating CGI cameras. Turns out they weren't flying, they were diving.
Wealthier coastal cities have been dealing with their heritage somewhat differently. Their maritime colonial history lies beside other sunken ships, slave bones, and nuclear waste. Tourists don't really like to be confronted with that, though. Often, these cities prefer to take their monuments inland. One of the first cases of replicas occurred with an example of prehistory, the Chauvet cave paintings from the Upper Paleolithic. It was discovered at the end of the century, and with the influx of tourists, it began to degrade, similarly to what had happened at Lascaux. France created a replica of the Chauvet grotto with metal scaffolding and fiberglass appliques for stalactites. They had artists reproduce paintings once drawn by their prehistoric ancestors. They recreated the cave's humidity, the smell of the humidity. After the failure of Lascaux, this replica was a backup image of history.
Laser scanning allowed all of this. It was used in architecture and civil engineering for a while beforehand, but the preservation of ruins has since become the extension of virtual reality you see here.
So I'm not sure if you could hear all of it, but at the end they talk about having a backup image of history. So these are sort of digital simulations of either ancient sites or maybe soon to be ancient sites. What a backup image of history through laser scanning and other methods of digital simulation of lost realities could also be thought of is the insufficiency of symbolic representation in general today. Symbolism is so well packaged for easy consumption in mass culture that its political potential within the arena of contemporary art is increasingly dubious. How can ancient symbolism be appropriated or weaponized by the artist when it's been emptied everywhere else? I think we do have time for one more video, so I'm just going to show 2 minutes of it. This is a work by Karen Ferrari that you can see at the exhibition next door.
Katy Perry's music video for the song Dark Horse is the encoded depiction of the ritual magic an occult elite uses to ideologically secure its power. It also shows the role that the pop star plays in this, and how the mystical concept of the third eye mutates into a monstrous surveillance machine. This boat is a replica of an Egyptian sunbark, a funeral boat that transported the embalmed body of the pharaoh, who was thought to be reborn as a god like the sun rises after every night. The tracking shot ends when Kate is exactly in front of the sun. There is a connection between sun worship, conceptions of God, and modern celebrity culture. Celebrities are even named after the sun, which as an astronomical object is a star as a matter of fact. The cult of the sun evolved into monotheism. Celebrities are worshipped like gods.
Yeah, y'all know what it is. Katy Perry, Juicy J.
The servants in Katie's postures are symmetrical and they wear the same colors, indicating that they are both part of the star-sun god system. The scene is about the relationship with the fan, who is essential for the construction of fame. The blue eye on her hair is a hieroglyph called the Eye of Horus. It addresses myths around the third eye that endowed Osiris with the ability to see in the dark. It represents the pineal gland inside the brain that was considered to be the seat of the soul in ancient Egypt. The pineal gland actually is sensitive to light and is brought into connection with her sixth sense. The Eye of Horus is the origin of the Eye of Providence, a symbol that is called all-seeing Eye of God as well. It appears in Christianity to symbolize the omnipresence of God and is also part of Freemason symbolism.
Okay, you get the idea. It goes on for 20 minutes. This paranoia critical reading of an incredibly popular element of American pop culture on the surface seeks to find hidden messages within mass media. The artist's attempt to dig up occult or even sinister meaning in a media landscape that flattens all symbolism from different cultures and times into a conglomeration of empty signifiers expresses a desire to find new logics beyond the logics of the market that determine aesthetics. The result of the video wavers on the verge between parody and obsession. It both mocks the shallowness of the imagery in the original video and desperately tries to imbue it with something more. Eco-art in the lineage of land art that Lepard wrote about is the kind that attempts to reinvest symbolism with meaning in a society where #eco has become a selling point and a branding tactic. This eco-art does not insist on tying signifier to referent in a 1-to-1 ratio. It does not insist that it is what it looks like. This eco-art seeks continuity with the deep past and future, even with a persistent public discourse of rupture and apocalypse. This eco-art denies that there is an opposition between the fleeting and the permanent, the body and its environment, the figure and the ground. This eco-art refuses to be employed as a benign decoration by regimes unwilling to allow art as a form of dissent. This eco-art takes responsibility for its own means of production and impact on the environment. This eco-art does not represent nature, but does something with it. This eco-art is art that does not preach the end of humanity nor our irrelevance, but looks to the past for signs of the more than human to imagine what we will become. As it evolves, eco-art will need to enact what it imagines. It will need to integrate the ethics of its own production into its symbolic content. Whether physical or digital, all artworks have physical substrates. They have material effects on the environment. So it's through a consideration of the repercussions of material action on the dying planet that will allow eco-art to stay politically relevant. This is, if in a new sense, to return to the project the embodied feminist practices of land art pursued to integrate art and life. This will entail reaching beyond, This will entail reaching beyond Western science industrial approaches and methodologies in search of new ways of relating to our planet by rediscovering very, very old ones. Lepard said that, quote, primal people made sense of the universe through visual metaphors, unquote. And I would argue that however complicated and refracted and commodified our relationship to these forms have become in late-stage capitalism, we still can and do try to make sense of the universe in that way. I would like to end with this contribution to the Biennale by an artist called Hussein Mert Erverdi, which is called Primordial. It's a video of microscopic slides colored with acrylic dye, which are shown to a soundtrack of a modified Vela pulsar's neutron star radio wave emissions. The images resemble both cells dividing and nebula expanding in space. The telescope, after all, was invented using the same basic technology as the microscope. A square centimeter of Earth has as much, if not more, to study and imagine than 1,000 miles of outer space. And I will show this online. Or maybe it didn't buffer. In which case, I think we will end.
Thank you, Elvia, for such an interesting discussion and lecture. You can use this thing to translate the questions. Есть ли у кого-нибудь вопросы? Можете сейчас задать их Элвии Уилк.
Hello, hi. I would like to thank you because I think it was really, really brilliant. I don't know, can you hear?
Yeah, I
yeah. I was really impressed by your way of combining, in a very trans-historical way. I wanted to ask you about how you see the relationship between bio-art and eco-art, because I think it's something a little bit blurred, and I was really surprised to hear the artist, I don't remember the name, but the one working with the bubble, that she was speaking about life and prolongation of life, but I'm not sure that a bubble can really represent that. So yeah, thank you again.
That's a really great point. I mean, cybernetics has sort of been weirdly lost in a lot of contemporary discussion. It's something that elsewhere I've definitely argued for returning into the discourse, especially because cybernetic feminisms did really interesting stuff. And it's only recently that I've become, I guess, invested in the potential for land art as well. I started thinking about cybernetic feminisms first, and it took me a while to realize that what land artists were doing was actually just as complex and quite similar. But I wonder about this too. I mean, I think specifically, drawing from the work shown at the Biennale, and so that's one perspective of what eco-art could be. There are lots of other sort of conglomerations that we could talk about. But definitely at the Biennale, I think that eco-art is pretty divorced from like bodily human systems, which is a really interesting stance. I mean, that very separation says a lot about the way that this art thinks of, I think really just a world without us. I mean, I think what's being imagined is that our system of understanding will be abstracted from our body and embedded and preserved in systems, which should take us back to cybernetics, but I think hasn't yet. I wouldn't be surprised if in the next few years, cybernetic stuff kind of has maybe a return. I don't know if that answers the question, because I don't know if you were talking specifically about cybernetics, were you? Okay.
Будут ли еще вопросы у кого-нибудь?
Да, я хотел бы еще раз вас поблагодарить за выступление. Очень все понравилось, особенно видео. Мой вопрос заключается в следующем. Вы говорили о том, что, точнее, из вашей презентации следовало, что раньше художники использовали свои тела, какие-то органические инструменты для того, чтобы выражать себя. А сейчас, насколько я увидел, они используют не органику, те же самые шарики и все такое. То есть, получается, это тренд. Люди перешли от использования своих тел к чему-то нематериальному. К чему-то материальному, точнее. От органики к материи. Вот. Это тренд или нет?
So just to repeat the question for English speakers, more or less it's about whether or not the trend could be construed as a use of organic materials, including the human body, to a use of inorganic materials. And I did think about that quite a bit, but I think I shied away from making that generalization. I don't think it's actually a transition from organic to inorganic, but rather a transition in how we observe the barrier between those. I think that we now understand organic to mean all sorts of things, like living embodied computer systems that evolve and for all intents and purposes have life cycles of their own. So I don't think that we've like the material itself has shifted from, say, being organic matter to being hardware. I think it's rather that the understanding of what those two categories are has kind of, if not dissolved, then at least shifted. I think you'll find, like for instance, the artwork with the meat on the rocks, it's definitely still dealing with organic stuff. It's still quite fleshy, and I think a lot of the art in this biennale is very organic still.
Будут ли еще вопросы у кого-нибудь? Кому-нибудь дать микрофон?
Thank you for your question.
Все, вопросов больше нет. Спасибо вам большое за то, что присоединились к нам сегодня. Я бы хотела поблагодарить наших партнеров. Это компания Novatec, это Аксенов Family Foundation. И мы очень благодарны Тех-хабу «Ключ», который нас здесь сегодня принимает. Спасибо вам большое. Мы вас ждем в следующий четверг. Будет дискуссия между двумя художниками. И, в общем, спасибо, что пришли к нам. И следите за нашими обновлениями на Фейсбуке. Хорошего вечера. Спасибо. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.